the South African Communist Party Central Committee. He is the senior advisor of the StreetNet International, also a she organizing workers, representing workers in as representing the constituency of the communities. Responsible for collective bargaining in informal economy in WIGO, which is Women in Informal Employment, and Organizing. Comrade Pat is also a member of the National Task Team on implementation of the International Labour Organization Recommendation 204 on transitions from informal to formal economy, part of the Decent Work Country Program. The community constituency representative, that is Comrade Pat on Network, as we have already indicated. Lastly, I can indicate that she is still active in the Women in Informal Employment by forging links with SEWA, which is the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. Comrade Pat worked very hard in the establishment of the first trade union for self-employed women in South Africa in 1993. Her association with SEWA led to her becoming the first international coordinator for StreetNet, an international alliance formed to improve the lives of street vendors, market vendors, and hawkers, the majority of whom are women around the world. That is Comrade Pat, who is presenting to us today on this topic of informal sector and socialism. The manner in which we will run this school, comrades, is such that, as we know, that we are live streaming. But once the presentation is over, we will then cut off the live streaming and continue with discussions here on Zoom. Comrade Pat, you are welcomed, my leader, and this is your opportunity to present on informal sector and socialism. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Comrade Nomarasha. I'm just going to, can I just request that you enable the screen sharing so that I can put Jenny, if I can, so that I can put my slideshow up, because it's telling me that the host has disabled the participant screen sharing.
Comrade Pat, just double check it. It is enabled.
Let me just try again. Yeah, great. Okay. Let me just put it up now. And the other day I put one of these and I could not find the button to get it up properly. Now I've learned how to do it. I practiced. Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Comrade Nomarasha. And thank you to all of those who I can see here on the screen, and then welcome to you, and then to those that are listening on the live streaming. So the first issue when we talk about the informal economy is to recognize that it consists of different sectors. We no longer talk about the informal sector because there's so many different sectors, including street traders, market traders, spaza shops and informal cross-border traders, waste pickers, and then among the waste pickers there are street collectors as well as those who collect on landfill sites, and recyclers, and then taxi workers, which includes drivers, conductors and washers and rank marshals, home-based workers, also including care workers and community health workers, domestic workers, agricultural workers, and subsistence fisher people. So some informal workers have employers, but are informally employed by virtue of not being registered for UIF or workman's compensation, or any other employment related social security schemes. So this goes for the majority of domestic, agricultural and taxi workers. So in the case of some of those workers, there are sectoral determinations, but on the whole, their employers don't tend to comply. So about 18.8% of all workers who have an employer are informal in this sense. The rest of the informal workers are self-employed, what we call own account workers. Before the start of the lockdown, they numbered 1.774 million people nationally. And they also don't enjoy social protection beyond universal grants. And although they provide services to communities, like providing cheaper services and goods, including fresh food, and the collection of recyclables, which also creates huge savings for municipalities. So, I don't know why my thing is just, okay, it's running itself. Okay, so what have the workers in the informal economy been saying since COVID-19 caused the lockdown? So informal workers called on government to make urgent arrangements to redirect funds, which were not going to be spent on other things, and establish a living cash grant to all informal workers, regardless of nationality. Eventually, after 4 weeks, the special COVID income grant of 350 Rand a month for 6 months was announced for those who had lost their livelihoods. This was much less than people had hoped for. And as a result, the majority of workers in the informal economy preferred to go back to work if at all possible, because they hoped to earn a slightly better livelihood if they could go back to work. So then they've called on the different tiers of government, and obviously local government's a major one here, to help make their work safer with the following urgent interventions: mass provision of protective masks and gloves to all informal workers, especially those working with members of the public, organic and waste materials, and especially where cash exchanges hands. This is where we talk about gloves, because otherwise we don't really talk about gloves much. And then also the mass provision of water, soap, and sanitizers in public spaces. So since then, the informal workers who are working in public space have put together a whole list of demands. The one is the do no harm principle, that police and other enforcement officials need to stop harassing traders. And secondly, similarly to the way in which evictions have been made illegal, that confiscation of traders' goods during lockdown also needs to be made illegal, because it impoverishes people unnecessarily. And then there are health and safety demands to facilitate safe trading, provide unlimited water points so that traders can wash hands, workplaces, and products frequently, the provision of sanitizers and or bleach as a matter of urgency, to be flexible about trading layouts. This is for social distancing, so that street and market traders can practice physical distancing. And then also to allocate or repurpose more land or more streets for trading. And then to identify unused space like fields or parking lots where food markets could be set up, and to provide health screening at trading sites. Then it's necessary for there to be a serious simplification of licensing and a suspension of fees, because the issuing of permits is very complicated and difficult to access. This needs to be made simple and fair. And then trading fees need to be suspended while traders reestablish themselves. Then there's the issue of the income support and grants to reestablish. So informal workers have been hit particularly hard by measures to prevent the spread of COVID, and they do need some direct income support, especially those people in the sectors who only started working very recently, like the barbers, the street barbers, etc. Their businesses opened up much later than others. And traders have used their last savings over lockdown, and they need cash grants to start trading again. Then we need to recognize what are workers in the different sectors saying, because there are slightly different issues for all of them. So for informal traders, there needs to be a reduction of red tape to an absolute minimum in the municipalities' permit systems. And this is not the time to introduce different administrative issues which municipalities had failed to solve before lockdown started. We've seen a bit of a tendency of some municipalities trying to do this. And then there needs to be support for informal traders leaders and the leaders of spaza shop associations to disseminate health guidelines for informal traders in streets, markets, and spaza shops. So I have sent a document pack through to Comrade Jenny, and this can be sent to everybody who's at this workshop, and these health guidelines are among that document pack because they've been prepared, they're ready for use. And this is to help people to move, the leaders to move around safely, and or provide airtime to them so that they can disseminate information on broader implementation. Then with informal cross-border traders, obviously because borders have been closed for people, they haven't been closed for goods. The problem with informal cross-border traders is that they move across the borders with their goods, unlike big companies that are able to freight their goods across and get them through. So there's some discussion going on at that level. And there also needs to be some clarity with regard to the reopening of borders and an introduction of a system which is called the Simplified Trade Regime for seamless border crossings. And in that document pack, I've got a discussion paper on the Simplified Trade Regime, which is a system organized by COMESA a few years ago, and that the SADC region at the end of 2019 agreed to adopt the Simplified Trade Regime system. So that includes our country as well. In the taxi drivers, rank marshals, conductors, and washers, at the moment they are squeezed between their bosses who have instructed them to load up 100% of passenger loads, and the law, which says they can only load up 70%. And of course, they get caught by the cops, and then they get fined, and their bosses who've instructed them to ignore the law are not the ones who pay the fines, it's them. So they've actually submitted these demands, these 9 demands here, to NEDLAC, because we managed to get one of the representatives of the taxi drivers in to the NEDLAC Rapid Response Subcommittee on Transport. So they're saying they want to be directly represented with the Transport Ministry and sit on the NEDLAC community. So we've managed to get them in there. And they say they don't want the taxi owners' organizations to represent the taxi workers and the auxiliary services of the taxi industry, because they feel that they only represent the owners and they don't speak or look after the needs of the workers. The COVID-19 relief funds, they say, are not being filleted to the grassroots levels. Well, of course, at the moment, it hasn't gone to anybody yet, but they don't trust that when those relief funds come, that any of those will go to the drivers. So they want to work directly with the Departments of Transport and the Department of Labor. They also want the Department of Labor to recognize the taxi workers and accredit them with the UIF scheme. There's been some movement in that because there was an amendment made by the Minister of Employment and Labor saying that even people whose employers haven't registered them with UIF will be able to apply. So we're busy working on how to get them to be able to apply now to the TERS scheme. So basically, they feel that the taxi workers are ignored and left out of all negotiation. And that's where we've made a little bit of progress in the last month. And they say that by registering the taxi workers, it will reduce the unemployment rate by 15% and regulate the industry. That's really something to think about. They say that the taxi industry represents 65% of the transport industry. And in KZN, which is where the representative comes from, he says they have more than 380,000 taxi drivers. They're also saying that given the right tools, the taxi drivers and marshals can monitor and record passengers' relation to COVID-19. Then with home-based workers, they need help getting registered on a database in anticipation of the large-scale production of masks, including mapping out how many members there are, what they're currently doing, and what would be their capacity to produce masks. And then this needs to be shared with relevant departments that would guarantee a transparent way of allocating government orders to all the home-based workers. Community health workers are registered, although not employed, with provincial authorities. But they're expected, even more so now during COVID-19 pandemic, to offer their services. But they're not being provided with PPE or safe transport. So this is clearly not acceptable in light of the fact that they also have no social protection coverage. Waste pickers are demanding the integration of waste pickers into solid waste management policies and waste plans of municipalities in line with waste pickers integration guidelines, which have been prepared over the last couple of years and are also included in that document pack. It's a very interesting document. Then with domestic workers, their problem again is non-compliance by employers with UIF provisions. And they've been having this problem that if their employer isn't a contributor, then they also can't claim through no fault of their own. But this has also now been addressed to some extent through the Department of Employment Labour, saying that people whose employers haven't applied can still apply. Because until that point, domestic workers who were trying to make claims themselves through normal channels, but their claims were not being processed. Then the subsistence fisher people for the coastal cities, there needs to be a drastic reduction of red tape with regard to their access to piers and beaches. Luckily, the Department of Environment, who mistakenly called them recreational fisher people, maybe it's because the minister lives in Gauteng and she doesn't live near the sea, because these guys are not recreational fisher people. They support their families and then they sell their excess in the communities. Luckily, they were allowed to go back to work just before the sardine run hit. So the sardines fed many, many families of fisher people and their communities at that time. So they all regarded as a gift from God, that. If you looked at the social media. Then there's lots of informal workers who are asylum seekers. And the problem is that all the conditions for applying for benefits or whatever, or permits, usually require them to produce their asylum seekers permits. However, there were massive backlogs in the issuing of asylum seekers permits, and some Department of Home Affairs officers had stopped taking new applications long before COVID-19. So as a result, many asylum seekers are still not documented as required by permit regulations, and this is through no fault of their own. So the issue then is, if we're looking at the road to socialism, what are the emerging opportunities? So in this bloodbath of loss of traditional jobs that we are anticipating, we also anticipate permanent behavior changes. The most immediate, which have already started, more people working from home, more virtual conferencing, and e-commerce likely to be used more widely. So how do we turn this into a transformative recovery program for the proletariat, both with and without work? So I've just looked at Cuba, which I was fortunate to visit a couple of years ago. After the collapse of the sugar industry in Cuba, a large part of the resultingly unemployed proletariat became own account or self-employed workers, selling goods and services. Many of them in the tourist industry, just like many other countries in Central America and the Caribbean. And in 2010, the Cuban government formalized this proletariat. They call them cuenta propistas, trabajadores por cuenta propia, which means own account workers, by passing a law which recognized them as workers and enacted super simple registration procedures, totally minus red tape, for them to regularize their status. So what can we learn from this for a transformative recovery program coming from a very low base with lots of unemployment? Firstly, economic activity in the informal economy can always start up more quickly and with smaller capital outputs than large formal businesses which have collapsed. That's an advantage. And to ensure the transition from informal to formal economy is fast-tracked in the process of economic recovery, in line with the conditions of the decent work and the guiding principles of ILO Recommendation 204, which is a rights-based type of formalization, not the kind of unilateral formalization whereby municipalities kick people off streets because they're not formal enough. So this is an opportunity, but if we fail to do it, it could result in increasing informalization, with workers and economic units in the informal economy being relegated to the role of permanent grant recipients, which is not the way that they self-identify, as you can see from their decision that they want to go back to work instead of waiting for grants. So bottom-up recovery, economic recovery program, which we would need to look at, should enlist the proactive cooperation of representative organizations of workers and economic units in each sector of the informal economy to obtain their buy-in and cooperation in encouraging their members to comply with the provisions of the prevailing level of lockdown as we go through the different levels, and proactively sensitizing people with regard to social distancing, sanitizing, etc. in public space. Also, local enforcement agents need to be trained, as do the SAPS and the SANDF, on the implementation of do no harm measures for security forces. I've mentioned before, the confiscation of informal traders' goods needs to be scrapped in order to allow them to get back on their feet again. The other thing we need to do is to build and or strengthen the social solidarity economy as part of a deliberate recovery program for the construction of a new economy, which is different from before. What we see in this picture is a cooperative organization building in Nicaragua, which it says this is the time for the cooperatives. Then an obvious one is the national health insurance. Now is the time to take advantage of the improved cooperation between the public and private health sectors, which we've seen during this COVID-19 crisis, and fast track the process of establishing the national health insurance. The other issue is the basic income guarantee. We've got our foot in the door, I would say, even though, with this 350 Rand grant, which is very small, but the basis has been laid for this to be established on a more permanent basis for all workers who are not earning a basic income, although clearly many flaws in the administration of such grants have to be urgently addressed, because the implementation of 350 Rand one is really appalling. I don't think I even have to convince anybody of that. Then we need to look at the fourth industrial revolution and the informal economy. And we need to campaign for smart investment in free Wi-Fi for all, including in townships and rural areas. What you see in this picture is one of the hangout hotspots in a small tourist town in Cuba, which is a place where they don't have very good connection because the blockade really affected their contact with internet. But even there, they've seen the need for Wi-Fi in public spaces. We need to have it everywhere. So new forms of work, such as platform work based on internet platforms and easily accessible popular apps, which is increasingly common in the services sector, are often called the new informal these days. And this is due to the fact that these new forms of work are being informalized as soon as they appear. And the fact that the government seems to be generally very slow to integrate the emerging new forms of work into their regulatory systems. And where they do, it's often to criminalize them. So one consequence of this is that many of the workers engaged in these new forms of work have become own account workers. And the work they do has become own account work, undertaken at the initiative of currently officially unemployed or underemployed workers who cannot find employers to sell their labor power to, and nor can they succeed as entrepreneurs in small enterprises. So they are joining the growing reservoir of de facto own account workers, irrespective of what the system labels them as. So new forms of organization of workers in the sector are emerging. I don't know if you've noticed what they call entregadores in Latin America. Food deliverers and so on have been having strikes because of lack of coverage during the COVID time, and the business has gone down and so on. So there are new forms of organization, especially in the transport and food delivery sectors, and also innovative systems of collective bargaining are also emerging for the negotiation of contracts, establishing agreed wages and working conditions in these sectors. So what are the possibilities of proletarian control of identified sectors of means of production? There's a bit of a difference between the industrial sector, where everybody's sort of worried about robotization, and then the service sector, where it's more the issue of apps. although I've seen a recent piece of work about some very interesting results, even in a robotic situation, a study that was circulated by Comrade Alex about Volkswagen, who managed to change production and increase the jobs and so on. Here I'm talking a bit more about the digital means of production in the services sector, putting the gig economy in the hands of people instead of multinationals like Airbnb, Uber, etc. And here, what I'm suggesting is that we look at the possibility of a takeover by people's apps in the face of the collapse of malls, which has already started due to technological changes in banking and starting in the retail sector. And then fundamental changes in both supply and demand in the taxi hailing sector. And the list of new examples is increasing by the day. I think it's something we should give serious attention to. Oops. So these various windows of opportunity that I've talked about, how do we take advantage of that? So firstly, our approach in relation to the informal economy needs to be sector-based. We need to stop this talking about the informal sector as if it's one sector, because then we're not likely to be very focused or targeted in our approach. The intervention strategies need to be inclusive, transparent, simple, universally accessible, and non-discriminatory. And interventions are needed to ensure that informal work startups are not frustrated by bureaucratic red tape and then forced to operate clandestinely, which is where we're starting from, or even to close down. So one of the important issues is databases. This is quite a challenge for us. Inclusive information needs to be collected according to different sectors of the informal economy, both from agreed categories, that means workers and economic units. Economic units means SMMEs, cooperatives, etc., like units of economic activity. And then the workers are the individual workers. And then these need to be disaggregated by gender, age, disability, and nationality. And data needs to be collected inclusive of everybody in the sector. This is what we've been trying to convince municipalities of. There's no point of just collecting databases of people that you've given permits to, because that's already a selected group, and it's not everybody, and you can't plan if you don't have all the numbers. So to enable accurate and effective planning, data collection also has to have the capacity to track movements in the sector. As the informal economy grows and subsides with changes of the economy, because remember, it's going to grow now as unemployment in the formal economy decreases as a result of COVID-19. So it's like a moving target. So static databases are ineffective to capture this moving target. Then there's a whole range of health issues. And one of them is to prepare a just framework and for managing the reoccupation of public spaces, both as workplaces and as public transit spaces and terminals. That's what's really affecting us now during the remaining phases of lockdown and until after the end of the state of disaster. Even when we got to stage 3, we've seen to level 3, we've seen this impact and the problem of members of the public being negligent about the protocols or whatever. So this is the role of provincial government working together with local government. So monitoring the implementation of health measures for getting informal workers back to work and keeping them safe in their workspaces is part of the graduated process of getting the economy working again. And the picture there is a picture of what they've been doing in Sierra Leone, a place where they've had a lot of public compliance with health protocols, partly because the public in Sierra Leone, this is not their first pandemic. They just recently dealt with Ebola. So they're much more compliant than our public is. And this is what they've been doing at all the selling spaces in markets and so on, people having sort of hand washing stations at every single stall. So the elimination of red tape now, what kind of thing are we talking about? And this is to ensure that informal work startups are not frustrated by bureaucratic red tape and forced to operate clandestinely. So the kind of things that need to be done, one thing is the establishment of well-functioning, user-friendly one-stop shops and or centers, call centers in every district municipality. Here in KZN, we had a webinar where we were told about a one-stop shop. One of my colleagues decided to test this out, and he got sent from pillar to post for a whole day. And in the end, he wasn't helped. So there's no point in having a one-stop shop unless it works. And the same for call centers, but there's a need for that. And then there needs to be an overhaul of permit systems in every municipality to make them fit for purposes, for purpose. Permit systems need to be inclusive and fit for the purpose of getting workers and economic units in the informal economy back to work and contributing to economic recovery. And this means irrespective of nationality. We're having a lot of problem with our government departments making certain things available only to South Africans. And the non-South Africans that are in South Africa during COVID are here, there's nowhere they can go, and they're going to starve just as much as everybody else, and it's going to be just as bad for the government if they starve as well. So that one can't justify not doing it for everybody who lives here. Then I've addressed this in the next one. Obstructive permit requirements need to be removed. So firstly, fees need to be reduced to affordable rates. Requirements to be registered with the CIPC, which the Department of Small Business Development keeps on doing. I mean, this makes them just completely inaccessible to people, to most of the people in the informal economy. And then this issue about for non-South Africans, there's an issue called special visas issued saying that people are allowed to work here. Those special visas don't exist for the informal economy. They only exist for the people who've got contracts in the formal economy. Work permits only apply to migrant workers with formal jobs. So basically for non-South Africans, the economic migrants, simple passport identification should be sufficient and not the special visa story. And then I've mentioned about asylum seekers. Because of the fact that the asylum seekers permit system stopped working even before COVID. And so there's a massive number of genuine asylum seekers who haven't got permits through no fault of their own. So basically other forms of identification of asylum seekers are going to need to be used, such as affidavits. So what is a revolutionary program for activists? Starting from the point of view of the informal economy, looking about moving towards socialism. So the first thing is to deepen our class analysis of contemporary labor market phenomena, including informal economy and new forms of work, like the gig economy and the platform economy. Then we need to engage with membership-based organizations of workers in the informal economy and work with them alongside the traditional trade unions. We cannot rely purely on the traditional trade unions if we want to seriously work with the sector. And then we need to expand the level of working class unity in organization by supporting the struggles of organized workers in the informal economy. And this means that whenever workers in the informal economy are asked to support trade union struggles, these need to be adapted to include specific demands of the workers in the informal economy. I try to talk to trade unions a lot about this. Some of the trade unions have heard me on this. Others are still not hearing us. So they'll say to the street traders, please support our minimum wage strike. Well, to be honest, most street traders are not going to go on strike so that other people can get minimum wages. So there has to be, there have to be specific demands of the workers in the informal economy, which includes own account workers for joint struggles. And it's doable. We've had many of them in this country. So we need to build this broad working class front of progressive forces that the 14th Congress of the SACP talked about to promote a platform of macroeconomic demands which are consistent with the inclusive policy demands of membership-based organizations in the informal economy, anti-austerity, anti-neoliberal, and anti-corruption. Then what other kind of campaigns can we do? The picture here shows a little campaign that we had called The City We Want, and it was run by the South African Informal Traders Alliance in 2018, I think it was. And I think they did it in about 5 different cities around the country. And trade unions also joined this struggle, and it was, it was a small campaign, but it was quite helpful. Then I think we need to have some Red October campaigns focusing on local government, because that's the level of interface for many workers in the informal economy. And there we need to engage organized street vendors, waste pickers, fisher people, and taxi drivers as distinct from taxi owners to bring in their key demands and make them central to these campaigns. And then introduce the following campaigns in all municipalities. The one, the integration of waste pickers and solid waste management. The other, the management of public space in negotiation with street vendors. The creation of inclusive cities in accordance with the new urban agenda. That's something I forgot to put in the document pack, but we can do that. And then the campaign for free Wi-Fi throughout the city, including townships, and transparent and meaningful participatory budgeting. Participatory budgeting was talked about a lot during the early part of this century, but it was lip service in most cases. You know, when we tried to actually do that, we found it extremely difficult to access that. Then what we are talking about is establishing collective negotiations forums at local government level with a commitment to maintain a practice of monthly meetings with organized workers in the informal economy. There's a lot of talk about social dialogue, and then people talk to you about meetings which are impossible to access. Something like monthly meetings at local government level is something we were doing just before the lockdown, and we'd like to get back to that. And we're looking at getting the municipalities to start doing this on a virtual basis with the leaders of informal workers organizations. Then I think we should consider a campaign for the ownership of the digital means of production, including things like data prices must fall, free Wi-Fi in public space, pressurize the government to review regulation and re-regulate in sectors to take account emerging new forms of work and the new markets that these are creating. You know, one of the new markets, if you think about the number of youth who move around with Uber and Taxify, or Bolt as it's called these days, that's a market which never existed before this new form of work emerged. So there's actually a new market there, as well as new workers in that sector. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And then also, we need to ensure that regulation discourages monopolies and promotes popular ownership in the hands of own-account workers and economic units in the informal economy. And there's some interesting examples, actually. In the paper that I've sort of circulated, I mentioned an example about some of the African-originated opposition to Uber, for example, that's been set up at a more popular level. So this is the kind of technology that it's actually possible to have in the hands of ordinary people. Then I think that in study groups, there's a very interesting document which was done. It's a study called The Future of Work in South Africa that was done when we were preparing for the Future of Work, the ILO's centenary on the future of work. And this study has got an analysis of selected industries which identifies decreasing roles, in other words, jobs which are under threat, and increasing roles, which are new jobs which are appearing, including platform work in the gig economy, blockchain technologies, etc. And I think we need to study that, because the question of reskilling, how the same people that were doing traditional jobs that are in danger can be reskilled to do new jobs, so that you don't find some people losing their work and other people gaining new jobs, but you actually get reskilling of people that were doing the traditional jobs. Then digital training for youth, and that needs to have a priority focus on girls. What I am noticing with this virtual methodology, some of the girls and the women are falling behind on this. So we need to keep this really upfront. Even on the issue of, the transport sector, we need to get more girls going for driver's licenses, because the driving of e-hail taxis and so on, I've had very few female drivers so far in my experience of using them. Then we need to, have digital training for workers in traditional jobs at risk, as I've mentioned, as part of reskilling and upskilling. And then organize public hearings and consultations on the future of work in South Africa and massification of new forms of work, so that we can basically increase the number of people that are working. And, I think we should do things like offer prizes for the most innovative new ideas, resulting in measurable numbers of sustainable livelihoods. So, comrades, that's what I've got for you today. I haven't presented a paper because all of this is work in progress. So what you're seeing here is ideas that I've thrown together for the purpose of this presentation. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to interact with each other and develop this into something which is more logical and proficient and so on. And I thank you very much for allowing me to do this, to have some discussion with you on this issue. And then just to point out that this picture in this final slide is another part of the informal economy, the beach sculptors. Those of you who've been down to the coast will probably have seen this. It's a new kind of work that's emerged in the last, I would say, the last 10, 15 years. These guys who make these beach sculptures, and then people come and look at them, and if you take your picture next to it, you have to pay them, but you normally you pay them in the same way that you pay car guards. So their work also really suffered a lot when people weren't allowed to go to the beaches. So as you can see, they've vented their frustration through this beach sculpture. So that's it for today, and I'll be happy to engage now whatever comments and questions from the floor. And I'll take the